These are the last 3 lines of one of my favorite poems, The Road Less Traveled, by the poet Robert Frost. And it's been a theme that has been recurring throughout my life. And let's face it, when your mother gives you a name like Dorcas, you're already on a road less traveled. But I love the concept of doing things slightly differently, of maybe being a bit unpredictable, of maybe standing for a moment, stopping, and deciding to take a road that's not the one everybody else is taking. In my life, I've had a number of examples of this. But in recent years, I've had the opportunity to take a professional road less traveled. For most of my career as a lawyer, I was involved in litigation. And in recent years, I had the opportunity to change my skills and to choose mediation instead of litigation. I decided that having seen years of clients in courtroom battles, which were very unpleasant experiences, and discovering from my clients that actually nobody really enjoyed that experience. In fact, it was a terrible experience for them. I thought I would turn my skills to doing things differently and to offering my clients a different way of resolving their disputes, a better way to do it. And I have to tell you that without exception, it produces far more satisfied clients, mediation, than litigation ever did. Another example. When you think of lawyers, what do you think about? Don't answer that. Let me guess. You think mean, dull, boring, money-grabbing, sharks? Yeah, you're probably right. But what about a firm of solicitors that sets up a Twitter initiative that Sarah mentioned that is free for over 600 SMEs who are using it right now as we speak between 9 and 10 o'clock on a Thursday night? It's an initiative that, in fact, is so innovative that people frequently mistake us for a PR company or a marketing company rather than a firm of lawyers. Now, that's a bit less predictable, isn't it? But because we've taken that route, that less traveled route, we have gained so much profile as a firm, so much generosity from people in return for our generosity, that it's been absolutely phenomenal. But tonight it's about time. We live in an age when we can't do things fast enough. We never have enough hours in the day. We never have enough days in the week. How many times have you said, I don't have enough minutes in the hour? But what if we could do things differently? What if we could find time in a different way? We spend our time, we don't write letters anymore, we email. We don't walk, we drive. We don't phone our friends, we text them. And even that, even when we text, we want it to be quicker, so we choose autocorrect or predictive texting. And does it really work? Does it speed things up? Not with this one. This is a text that I sent a friend of mine a few weeks ago when she asked me how was the TED prep going. You might have noticed already, but I tried to say, I've got a session tomorrow with the comms team. I really didn't mean to say coma team, and I really wasn't trying to learn how to put you all to sleep, and I'm very glad to say that you haven't all fallen asleep. But the reality is that actually, if I typed the whole text out properly in the first place, I wouldn't have had to waste time going back, reading it, realizing it didn't make any sense to my friend, and then having to type it all over again. So sometimes the things that we think are faster are not actually working for us. So, for example, clicking on the sat-nav to take the motorway route is pretty obvious, faster way to get there. But what if we took the scenic route instead? What if we thought, we'll go that way and see what happens? And what if we had something to gain by taking the scenic route? And what if we didn't measure time in terms of quantity or speed, but what if we measured it in terms of quality instead? Let me give you an example. So the other night, I got home from work just in time to catch the last wee bit of daylight, and I thought, I'll walk the dog. The trouble was, I'd had a really long day. I was really tired. I had more work to do that evening. I was very stressed. I had my starving teenagers to feed. I had to do a bit of work later on. Oh, and I had to write a TED talk as well. So walking the dog was really not something I was doing for pleasure. It was really because I could tick it off. Another thing on my list. You know the feeling. That's another thing done. And it also meant that I wouldn't have to spend the evening feeling guilty when he looked at me with his big, sad eyes. the trouble was, I got in, marched into the house, changed out of my suit, got the dog lead, got the dog, and started to march off down the road. But Basil had a different concept of time. You see, Basil really wasn't under any pressure. Basil thought, we'll just mosey along, we'll stop and look at the scenery. He wanted to stop and greet every dog that he saw. He wanted to stop at every lamppost, as they do. He wanted to take the scenic route. So I'm marching along, totally ignoring the scenery. Basil's looking at the scenery, and Basil, even though he's just a Jack Russell, can stand his ground like a Rottweiler when he wants to. So Basil decided to stand his ground at one point, and being forced to stop, I happened to glance, taking the moment that was forced upon me, I happened to glance over my right shoulder. And this is what I saw. You thought I was going to show you some beautiful sunset. I saw a simple bin at the end of somebody's driveway with a sign on it saying, "Fresh apples, please help yourself." Nothing earth-shattering, not a beautiful sunset. But that moment that I stopped, was forced to stop, and looked around and saw this, stopped me in my tracks, literally, and also completely changed my mood for the night. Because what I realized was that actually what this was a really nice and rare act of kindness. It was an act of generosity. Because the owner of the apples could well have just thrown them in the bin that they would have been disposed of, another bin, might not have taken the time to sit down and write out a neat sign and put it and sell it with sellotape onto the bin. They could have sold them, actually, or they could have dumped them on their compost heap to reuse, but they didn't. What they did was they took the time to do this so that people walking past could help themselves. And that rare act of generosity really changed my mood for the whole evening. So Basil and I wandered back to the house, wandered this time instead of marching. We took time to look at the beautiful sunset over Strangford Lough, to listen to the birds on the shore, and we got back to the house at his pace, probably 15 minutes later than I should have on my list for the evening in my schedule. But actually, when we got back, my mood was so much better that the whole evening improved. So my cooking was better, because generally your cooking's better when you're in better form. And funny enough, in our house, if I'm in better form, I think everybody's in better form. So the mood around the table was better, Basil was a happy boy, and I actually had some inspiration for my TED Talk. So I had gained a lot. So what if we can actually not just improve the quality of our time by taking the road less traveled, but what if we could actually gain time? Now we're talking. So remember earlier on, we talked about not having enough hours in the day and not having enough minutes in the hour. Well, it turns out there's a way of actually finding those minutes in the hour. And believe it or not, there's also scientific proof of it. So in 2015, a study was carried out by the University of Warwickshire Centre for Competitive Advantage in the Global Economy. Yes, there is a centre called that, and there are definitely people who are very interested in finding out how to make people more productive. So they carried out this study, and what they did was they took 700 people, quite a sizable experiment, at random, and they gave them what they called happiness shocks. Lovely phrase. And what they did was, at regular intervals throughout their working day, they gave them their favourite snacks and their favourite drinks, and they showed them clips of their favourite comedies. And then when they were satisfied that all these people were happy by their own standards, they measured their levels of productivity. And guess what they found? They found that not only were they a wee bit more productive, but that they were an average of between 12 and 20% more productive. It's massive. It's absolutely huge. What that means that is, in theory, you could gain an hour and a half on a working day of 8 hours. Fantastic. See, we could find more hours in the day. It's quite incredible, really. But the question, of course, then is, how can we be happier? What is it that makes us happier, that then makes us more productive? Well, the answer is fairly simple, believe it or not terribly philosophical, but the answer is that, actually, we can find that happiness by taking the road less traveled. So one of my favorite TED Talks is by Sean Acker. It's called The Happy Secret to Better Work. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but if you haven't, watch it. It will completely change your life. And Sean's work is all about changing our brains to make them more positive and more effective. And when we're happy and when we're more positive, then our brains behave better, essentially. I'll tell you how it's done in a minute. But if you're familiar with the idea of trying to improve your mood by being more positive, and we all have a go at that sometimes, you'll know the concept. Earlier this year, I had hip surgery, and I discovered a really funny thing. I discovered that afterwards, when people asked me why I was on my crutches, if I said to them, oh, I had a hip replacement, they would say awful things like, oh no, that happened to my granny and she never recovered. But then I realized that if I said to them, oh, actually, I got a new hip, they would say, oh, that's fantastic, congratulations. Positive spin, and it made all the difference. It certainly improved my mood with my new hip. So back to Sean Acker's work. What Sean talks about is that we can actually have a positive effect on our brain because when we're happy, our whole system produces a chemical called dopamine. And dopamine makes us happier, but it also actually turns on, switches on all the learning centers in our brain so that our brains become much more efficient and much more productive and much more open to learning and doing things efficiently. So what that means is that when we're happier, we can completely change our mood and we can, again, go back to the point about being more productive. So let me give you an example of how that might work. Recently, I was driving into work. Usual crazy morning chaos. Did the school run, dropped off my daughter, heading into the city centre, which, as always in the mornings, is not a pleasant thing to do. But it was even worse than usual. I reached one of the major Belfast junctions, and there was absolute chaos. Turned out what had happened was a car had broken down on the inside lane. So as I came up close to the car, this poor lady was sitting looking very distressed with two little girls in the back of the car. And everybody around her were really not being helpful because they were tooting their horns, getting aggravated and staring at her as if she really wanted to be there and wanted to be causing that. And as if her day wasn't bad enough, nobody else was helping. I'll be honest, I nearly did the same thing. I was frustrated too. But just for a moment, I thought, do you know, I'm just going to see what I can do here. And I pulled up onto the car beside her, and I went over to the car, and I said, can I help you at all? And it turned out that this poor lady's phone had died as well as her car. So she was sitting there, her whole day had collapsed around her. These two little girls in the back seat were getting more and more fractious by the minute, and still all the plunkers around her were tooting their horns. So I said to her, I happened to have on my phone a mechanic's number that wasn't far away. And I said, look, I'll make a call, see what we can do. So got hold of my friend, the mechanic, who very happily said, amazingly, yes, I can be there in 15 minutes. Came to the car. In the meantime, I had a chat to her, got to know her a bit. We had a bit of fun with the girls, which distracted them a bit. And so things weren't quite so bad. The mechanic arrived. I left him to it, and everything looked as if it was going to be fine. And I headed on into my office. I was about probably 15 or 20 minutes later, maybe half an hour. But when I got there, I realized that I had the dopamine effect. I was glowing from having done something nice. And it meant that when I got there, actually, I probably was at least 20% more productive that day. So when those two roads diverged that morning for me, I chose the one less traveled. And that, as the poet said, made all the difference. Thank you.